If you do choose to have your camera on, you certainly may through the event. You will not be recorded. Only those of us who are unmuted and speaking into the microphone will be picked up by the recording, so don't worry about that. Please do stay muted and use the chat function to ask your questions as we go. You can ask a question at any point in the chat throughout the evening. David and I will be storing them up and we'll pose your questions for you when we get to time for audience questions at about 5:45. So please type questions into the chat at any time along the way. Feel free to do that. And then one quick note, as I think probably most people here know, these are tough times for independent businesses, not just bookstores, but all small businesses around the country. Please, please, please think about the businesses that you want to still have around after this is all over and support them, not just us, but your other favorite local businesses. Support them as best you can. In particular, help for independent bookstores, us or your local bookstore if you're not one of our local customers. Please shop early this year. We were actually just talking before all of you came on the call about the fact that there are pretty major supply chain issues going on in the bookselling world this year. And one way that you can really help out is by getting your shopping done as early as possible. With that in mind, we are hosting a bunch of our favorite sales reps later on in the week from a couple of publishing companies who are going to tell us about some great books that they recommend for holiday shopping this year. So come on back for that. And now I'm going to turn things over to my wonderful colleague David to introduce our guest authors tonight.
Well, thanks so much, Rachel. It is a real pleasure to finally get to introduce David Moloney. His debut novel, Barker House, was adored by Northshire master bookseller Alden Graves. And I was scheduled to host Dave for an in-person event in the spring, in May. We were just talking about this, at Northshire's Manchester location. But as we all know, the world and COVID had other plans. Alden said that Moloney's prose is as solid and unforgiving as the stone and concrete that surrounds his characters. Elizabeth Strout, the acclaimed author of Olive Kittredge, said, "Here is a voice to listen to, a voice as true as can be, with the right details rendered perfectly, cold as stone." While Andre Dubusse said that he has never read a stronger artistic debut, and that Barker House heralds the arrival of a new and important voice. We are also lucky to be joined by Benjamin Nugent, winner of the Paris Review's 2019 Terry Southern Prize. His debut collection of stories, Fraternity, was published by FSG in July. Zadie Smith said that he takes an unflinching look at the strange tradition of the all-male fraternity, which in his gifted hands begins to look like a very strange and insidious social experiment. And an early review said that he manages the mark of a master satirist to be simultaneously compassionate and ruthless. Please welcome to Northshire Live, Benjamin Nugent and David Moloney. Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much, guys. That was a really kind introduction. I'm really excited to be here asking David Moloney questions. All those comparisons of his prose to stone are true in the sense that it's incredibly solid and it can be incredibly hard, but it's also very much alive. I've always loved this book since I saw it in very early fragmented draft form as Dave's teacher. And so it's been a great honor to see it come together and be published and get rave reviews. Just to kick things off, Dave, you spent a number of years of your life as a corrections officer. This is before you were my student, in a prison, or a jail rather, known as the Valley Street Jail in Manchester, New Hampshire. That was from 2007 to 2011. And so what I want to know is, what about that period of your life appealed to you as the material for your first novel?
Well, I guess I never really planned to write about it while I was there. I was writing poetry, like really bad poetry. And, you know, it was mostly just interactions I had with inmates and coworkers. And then as, you know, I went through sort of the progression from, you know, naive rookie officer to, I guess after like 2 years, you're a seasoned veteran because of everything you see in a short amount of time. I was already reflecting on what was happening and what I was seeing. And, you know, I could see sort of a novel forming of, you know, telling the tale of an officer that goes through an entire career, you know, as rookie to lieutenant. And so those were, you know, my early drafts, and it was really boring. It was just, you know, everyday life of an officer with nothing interesting really happening. And I thought it was interesting because I had gone through it myself, but I was missing something. It just wasn't clicking. And so I decided to break up the book into different point of views, different characters, to sort of carry this narrative, you know, to give different, you know, viewpoints into the jail. And I think that's when I saw the project actually, you know, coming to life. And it was less about me trying to write this big fat novel, and it was more about just telling these stories of the individual people and characters.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you want to read a bit from us, from one
Sure.
of Gaz's stories?
Yeah, so I'm gonna read from, you know, the middle of the book. This is House, and this is Big Mike, and he's his high school ex-girlfriend has found her way onto his unit, onto his tier.
Yeah, I love that story. Yeah.
I held the steel door open with my shoulder and stood in the threshold of the cell. Nina was lying under the blanket, and I could see her bare shoulders, the top of her bare chest. Her desk was covered in letters and envelopes. There was a sliver of daylight coming in through the rectangular window above the desk. Most female inmates tried to spruce up their cells, taping kids' coloring sheets to the walls, collages made from magazine cutouts. They'd rub cocoa butter or lotion on the air vents. But Nina's cell was plain old brick and steel. It smelled like dirty laundry. An officer loudly made a call over the radio, and it echoed through the small cell. I turned my radio off to make certain there wouldn't be an open mic. Some of these guys sat on their radios, and the shit they let fly had led to fights in the parking lot. Feeling better today, I asked. She'd been depressed, enough that I think about her when I was at home while trying to watch the Sox. She slid into a county-issued yellowish white tank top. Everyone is blind. They walk around smiling, even you, Mike. There were a lot of philosophers in Barker House. Nina hadn't been leaving her cell much except the shower. She was trading phone cards for tuna packets and skipping meals. There's no right or wrong way to act, I said. I pretend it's a boarding house and you guys are just visitors waiting for your ride out. I wake up and feel sick. You won't be here forever. I told myself that. I thought maybe when she got out, I could help straighten her life out. I hadn't been searching for a girlfriend, but I wasn't against having one either. We could date ex-inmates. It was a matter of timing.
Cool. Thanks, Dave. That is one of my favorite chapters in the book. You know, as soon as I read that, even when you were my student, I recall just being like, oh, that's a great idea for a story. That's a great idea for a setup. A corrections officer, male, is working the female unit and discovers that his 9th grade girlfriend is one of the inmates. And I was wondering how you came up with that. Was that something that happened in Valley Street Jail, or did it come to you, you know, through some other means? Like, when did you stumble upon that premise for a story?
Well, we did have a female unit, and, you know, there was always this, you know, issue with putting male officers on the unit just because of, you know, human nature. And, but there was also, the sergeants didn't want to keep assigning female officers because it was sort of discriminating against them, not letting them work, you know, other tiers. And so I sort of thought it would be cool to set this up and see what Big Mike does, if he acts on it or if he doesn't. there was one instance of a guy I went through the training academy with, who sort of fell for a girl on the unit and waited till she left, and then they began dating. And then a few weeks later, he came into the jail on the wrong side, because they had gotten into a domestic dispute, and
Oh,
he threw a iron at her. And so within a matter of weeks, he went from a distinguished officer to disgraced, all because of this relationship. And so I kind of wanted to show a different way of going at that. And so Big Mike, you know, he does hug her and he does kiss her, and which is against the rules. But I also wanted it to be sort of okay because I had already done this in the previous life.
Right.
And I sort of wanted to toy with that idea.
Right. And I mean, we have his interior monologue, right? It's all written from his perspective. And so we know that his feelings toward her aren't exploitative per se, like they're mostly pretty tender. And there's two other main plots of the story, right? One is that he's hanging out with her daughter, right? Why does she want him to do that, do you think? Like, where do you think that desire of hers, that request, you know, please spend some time with my daughter, comes from?
I think
Not a
she,
request to make of your corrections officer.
no, it's not. And I think she sort of, you know, there's a lot of, you know, this hero worship with people in uniform. And, you know, I think she thinks that he could rescue her somehow.
Right.
Is this, you know, she tells him that the grandmother is looking out for her daughter Ava, and then we learn from Ava later in the story that the grandmother really isn't. And so I think, you know, Neen is lying to him while also asking for a favor that could cost him his job. And
Right.
and he's pretty willing to do it because he's also, you know, a lonely guy, and I think he also wants to save her too. It's almost like they're using these two things against each other, and they're both willing to do it.
Right. And then the other part of the story is his dad is going through chemo, right? His dad has cancer. And I'm curious, what made you decide to juxtapose those two storylines? His dad has cancer and his dad is kind of pressuring him into running a gambling ring among the other corrections officers. So there's a lot going on. And I love how it's this contradiction, like you're disposed to think of the dad kind of like, you know, like the you know, poor old guy, he's dying. And on the other hand, he's putting the screws on people who owe the money, punching them in the face. And I was wondering how you decided to juxtapose these things, why you decided in this chapter you wanted Big Mike's, you know, dying father who punches guys out storyline and the, you know, inmate who was his 9th grade girlfriend storyline. How do they resonate with each other?
I guess it was kind of a risk to pack so much into one story. But I wanted to show Big Mike kind of stuck between, you know, growing up and going straight and, you know, kind of retreating into his life. He could tell his dad no, he doesn't. He doesn't have to, you know, be collecting money from offices. You know, he's behaving badly in multiple facets in his life, and it doesn't really affect his actions too much. Like he's continuing to do both. And so it's kind of like a lot of men like in their mid-20s where they have to sort of decide, like, do I continue on this path, or do I finally decide to grow up? And I know a lot of guys who now I'm getting close to 40 who still act like they're 25 and will continue to do so. And so I think this is sort of a turning point for him. And this is something you taught me actually, to, you know, bring a character through a story and bring them to sort of a door, even if it's like a figurative door or a metaphorical door, and to end the story with them with their hand on the doorknob, right? and either they're going to go through or they're going to stay on the other side. And so I sort of had that idea with Big Mike, like I'm going to lead him to this place and see if the reader can decide if he's gonna grow up or if he's gonna keep being, you know, Big Mike.
Right. There is something very strange and romantic about the situation in that he and Nina, the inmate, are kind of star-crossed lovers in a sort of way. And I was wondering, you know, did you try to find ways to kind of get romance into this book, to get love into this book, despite its kind of grim, dark, institutional setting?
Yeah, it's one of those things where, like, you know, love can grow anywhere, and you know, it happened a lot at the jail, and it's pretty common in a lot of facilities.
You mean between guards and inmates it was common, or
guards and inmates, and there's also guards and guards in property, and so I think it's because, you know, you can see somebody in pretty you know, bad ways, and I don't know, empathy takes over, or in terms of, you know, the guards getting together. You know, I know at least 4 different couples that met working at the jail are married. And it's because you work in such a charged and, you know, sort of you rely on the person to have your back, your partners. And I think, you know, a lot of times you know them better than anyone else in their life knows them. Even the ones that are married, you know them better than their spouses know them. You see them at their best and at their worst. And that's sort of why I wanted to write a workbook like this, because that's where we, you know, we let our guard down. We also, you know, a lot of people I worked with know more secrets about me than my wife would, and it's just something about the work environment that allows us to be vulnerable. And so, yeah, I didn't put love in it to bring light into this, because I don't know, I think even some of the love stories in this, the people are not doing it the right way, if there is a right way. So I just think it's sort of, whenever I write a story, somehow love finds its way in. And I don't think I'm a romantic. I just find that I always tend to do that.
Well, in some ways, it's probably the ideal setting because you don't expect it. It comes a little bit more as a surprise in a dark place like Barker House. So, you know, I think because you're from the Merrimack Valley and you grew up hearing its patterns of speech, the dialogue in here feels very strange to me and very authentic. And I was wondering, how would you describe how people talk in the Merrimack Valley? Is there a way you could describe what's distinctive about it?
I guess like short, and we don't have a lot to say, but we don't say it. And you know, I had one of my students that read this said, I wouldn't normally read a book with so much cursing in it. And you know, I think, you know, whenever somebody does a satire in Boston or if Massachusetts, they gotta bleep out every other word, right? It's sort of like we're these crass people. And in some sense, yeah, I know, I see some people from Lowell in here, and they know you could just be driving, doing nothing wrong, and have an F-bomb thrown at you, and you don't know why. And so I would say short, I guess. And I tend to write my dialogue that way because I guess that's how a lot of people talk to each other, you know, in the Merrimack Valley. I think, you know, you say what you have to say and move on. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite parts of the book is the dialogue between Don and Ray. And some of the beauty of the way they talk to each other, these two inmates, is there's like a beauty of compression. They're like minimalist poets trying to get the things they say to each other in as few words as possible. Like, Ray, how hard is it to open a bag of soup? You know what I mean? Which is such a short, funny, mean way of saying, hey, I'm trying to sleep. Would you stop maybe opening that bag of soup really loudly? You know, instead it's like, how can I reduce this to 5 words? And Don says, I was in the shower too long. My fingers are all pruned. And there's a real beauty in there as well as comedy. It's like a beauty of compression. How can I open my mouth as little as possible?
Yeah, I think that's very much how I spend my day. But there's, that was also sort of something I was trying to write where I could show action without showing the action. It was kind of like a writing exercise for myself. And I really loved writing the Don and Ray dialogues. I never thought they would make it in the book, to be honest. I sort of saw an editor being like, absolutely, what is this and why does it belong here? But my editor loved it. We just had to find a way to sort of find out where to put them. Mm-hmm. And, I kind of thought of them as like palate cleansers from some of the more difficult stories. Let's get some of Don and Ray back here to slow down some of the heavier content.
Right. Speaking of the heavier content, a lot of fairly violent, abusive things happen in this book. It doesn't flinch, doesn't look away from that stuff. And it raises a question, you, in some ways, the timing was very poignant in that this book came out right around the time of the George Floyd murder, where the entire country watched shocked, basically, as a police officer murdered a man with a restraint in the street. There's a character in this book who dies in the course of a restraint. There's all manner of physical abuse of helpless inmates. What were your thoughts and feelings when that moment happened, when suddenly the entire country was thinking about this thing you had been writing about in some sense?
Yeah, it brought back a lot of sort of the mantra of, we used to say, if you can talk, you can breathe, right? And that was sort of, that was in our training. If they can talk, they can breathe. And I sort of had these flashbacks of all those times someone yelled, I can't breathe. And I said, if you can talk, you can breathe, right? It's sort of, I really thought that he's saying words, he's fine. And then when they stop saying words, then we need to get up. And I guess, that made me think, most of our restraint didn't last as long as they knelt on George Floyd's back, right? Our restraints were violent. They lasted 30 seconds. Once they were cuffed, they were picked up and they were moved. There was no laying on the floor. It was get everyone where they're supposed to be as fast as possible, contain the threat. It's a bit different in the streets because it's not a controlled environment like in the jail or a prison. In the jail and prison, we decide when people move, we decide where they go. And in the public, that's not the case. And so I had a lot of questions about, why the restraint lasted that long, right? It goes against a lot of the training. Isolate the person who's the problem. And it's curious why there was lingering there and what the point of that was. It also changed every conversation I had with podcasts, bookstores, interviewers. Every single conversation switched from author of BARKER House, great book. Okay, what do you think of what, immediately wanted to know what I was thinking, which was fine, but it was also, it's very different. I say this a lot in the book, you can't really equate a cop to a correctional officer because they're two completely different environments. Most COs don't carry any weapons but their mouths and their hands. So, there's no access to guns. So there are no accidental shootings or shooting people in the back. If COs had access to those, would that happen? Probably. Because it's the same type of thing. It's my life versus yours, or the threat was more than I thought I could handle. That kind of talk. So it just made me really reflect on a lot of the things I did, which I thought I had moved on from. So it was very somber to see it and then think of all the times I said those similar words to people in distress.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. You kind of, what you just said makes me think there was an element of kind of reflection on your past. And these characters a lot of them are explicitly Irish Catholic. And I was wondering if you felt like there was a kind of Irish Catholic aspect. I guess an Irish Catholic motivation, which would be to say confession in the writing of this book. Did you feel like in some sense it was kind of like a purgation or a confession? I'm going to get some things off my chest through these characters.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of, even in the first story right off the bat, I was already getting a lot off. That sort of I did, Mankins and O'Brien and Big Mike very much reflect my past. And so I worked in a mental hospital. We did do violent restraints with children. It was a difficult time, and a lot of, that Irish Catholic guilt, even like, I was an altar boy for, 8 years. And so confession was a big part of my childhood. Even, I got in an argument with my mom, we went straight to confession. Or, you got caught hitting your brother, straight to confession, right? And so, but once I got into the confessional, I didn't confess. And so I think that's sort of like the Irish Catholic guilt, it's we know we did something wrong and then just don't tell anyone and bottle it up. And I think I spent a lot of my time, a lot of my 20s probably walking around with that guilt and pretending that it wasn't there. And I think that reflects a lot of these characters. Instead of, it's easier not to open up to somebody by isolating yourself, right? By putting yourself in your own sort of little prison, your own apartment. You don't have to, have that drunken conversation at the bar if you just do it with yourself in your living room, right? And so I think a lot of that, that guilt just goes inward and inward until you explode, right? And so, and we see that in some of the characters.
Well, so I guess what you're suggesting is there's a kind of link between silence and violence for these guys, that because they don't express rage and ambivalence and guilt verbally, it comes out in physical ways. And that brings me to another question, which is the form of a lot of these stories is one thread is in the jail and it's the professional life of these guys. And the other thread is at home and it's the domestic life of these guys. And did you do that because you think the two are impacting each other? That like, silence in one realm can create violence in the other, or vice versa, violence in one realm creates these silences at home? Like how are they interacting, those two threads?
Yeah, it was, a lot of what we were told was leave your baggage at the door, right? Don't bring home into work. And I always wondered, well, where do I leave work? What door do I leave that baggage at? And then after a few years, you're just taking that baggage everywhere with you. And a lot of, offices, it was bar fights. It was, we were well known in Manchester to be problems after, midnight. And so
Corrections officers, they're among the cops. They'd be like, watch out for the COs.
Well, mostly the bouncers in the
I
guys.
see.
Yeah. And it was just because we were blowing off steam, right? Like everyone else, except our blowing off steam was violence. And so it became a blend for a lot of people I worked with. They forgot that they didn't have the power that they wielded in the jail on the outside. Once we left there, we were just, citizens. And a lot of COs would see something wrong, see somebody pocket something in the convenience store and tackle them, right? They thought that they were cops or something else. It was really hard to turn that switch off. If you went into a restaurant and you heard someone mouthing off to a waitress behind you, you were quick to turn around and stand up and say something to, right? It was just really hard not to always be ready to go and be ready to reprimand someone and tell someone to back up. And I feel like I wanted to show how after a few years that happens pretty quickly. And I always, I used to leave my boots, in my truck because I didn't want to bring that stuff into the house. And I sort of always thought that was like symbolic, like I was trying to leave that piece of work like outside. And I actually did well with the work home balance because I would just go silent at home. But a lot of officers were on
Well,
well, a lot of officers would be on their third or fourth wives.
Yeah.
And sort of, they took out their day at home, and I did the opposite, where I just kind of went silent. So
right.
I guess that worked because I'm still married. So.
Yeah. One of the things that interests me is that there's kind of this great unanswerable question hanging over contemporary, or unanswered question hanging over contemporary American literature, I feel, which is the country is trying to figure out this mystery, which is like, why do so many millions of Americans vote for Trump and embrace Trumpism? There's this new right-wing populism that wasn't really around when we were kids, didn't have the power it has now. And the guys you're writing about are very much the demographic that we associate with Trump voters, both times around, 2016 and 2020, which is to say white men who don't have college degrees. And that's kind of like the classic Trump voter demographic. And so I'm wondering if you think there's some, like this book doesn't address Trumpism per se, but you could say that it might address it obliquely. And I'm wondering if for you, the life experiences these guys go through, do you see them as leading them to right-wing populism or right-wing nationalism or other forms of right-wing politics? Do you see some interaction between these guys' lives and experiences and that way of looking at the world?
Yeah, I think I kind of did it with Tony. I guess he's the closest sort of, later in the book and to the slaughter, he sort of doesn't understand why his daughter would, move to the West Coast, have a kid with long hair and wear, Nirvana t-shirts and,
right.
And he doesn't like how his wife's cooking him like quinoa and I think it's because a lot of this demographic sees the world going by them in warp speed, right? And they can't slow it down. Things are changing faster than ever before. If you look at how long it took for gay rights to make it to the forefront, it didn't happen in 3 or 4 years. It happened in 25, 30 years. And now we're seeing movements happen really quickly. And I feel like the pushback is even more, they're trying to push it back even quicker. And I think that's sort of what I see in this. it's sort of, when I worked in New Hampshire, everyone had guns. Everyone I worked with were gun owners. And I live in Massachusetts, which is, I live only 3 miles from the border. So I worked in New Hampshire, but lived in Mass, and I still do. And so I was coming from this very liberal anti-gun area and going right into where, lunch would be like, well, what kind of guns do you own? I don't own any. I had a blue Hyundai with a Hillary Clinton sticker on my bumper. So I was very different than what I was driving into, and we're only 20 minutes apart, right? So I think it's a lot of that sort of, they want to slow down the world. And I was in a Facebook group. It's the Brotherhood of Correction Officers. There's over 1 million members, and I joined it while I was writing the group, just to sort of see what conversations they were having, because I'd been out of the job for 6 years, and I kind of wanted to see what they were dealing with. And it was very much, the postings weren't about work. It was all politics, and a lot of hate speech, and allowable hate speech. And so I got out of there very quickly, but I do think these things by nature work well in that field, if that makes sense.
Yeah, say more about that. What do you mean by work well in that field? I think like they kind of blossom in that field, or it's like fertile soil for right-wing thoughts, but say more.
Yeah, well, it's, especially in like New Hampshire, it's the second whitest state, in the country, behind Vermont. So it's easy. We talk about, echo chambers, and what happens when the entire group of people you work with is that echo chamber all day long, and there's never an opposing viewpoint, right? And then you go home and it's the same thing. And then, so I feel like that can, that can snowball. But I also think it's gun ownership is very much, we had gun lockers. So you walked into the jail with your gun, and then you put it into a locker, and then you walked into the secured facility. And when you left, you took your gun and left with it. So it was very much, the jail was pro-gun. And I don't know, I mean, it's hard to comment on police officers because I've never been one, but it's the brotherhood feel of the job, the group mentality. And you don't want to feel like an outsider. You don't want to feel weak. I remember when, I've still yet to ever touch a gun, but we went back to one of my coworkers' apartments, and he had all of his guns laid out, and they were showing each other, and and playing with them, and it's 3 a.m. And I sort of was like, that was like the most peer pressure I've had post high school in my life. It's like, why am I here right now? There was nothing about this that makes me want to be here, but I just felt like I couldn't leave. Like that was like, I had to go along. And if I wanted, you don't want to be an outsider in a place where you rely on 20 people to have your back, because when you make that call and they decide not to come, then what? And so you kind of want to just conform as quickly as possible.
In reality, I mean, I think, for these guys, these characters, this moment doesn't come, but you're different from them in that there was a moment in reality for you where you were like, I'm through with this place. I don't want to be a part of it anymore. Can you say what that moment was? Was there a turning point for you where you realized, even though there are great things about this job, it's union, you retire after, 20, 25 years, and, comparison to, say, military service, like there are some things that are pretty cush about it. It's a stable living. It puts you in a position of power. Was there a turning point where you realized you were able to walk away from those things, that you wanted to walk away from those things?
Yeah, I mean, I could have retired at 42 and started a whole new career. And now I'm 36. I'm kind of like, maybe I should have stayed. But it, there was a sergeant who he was probably the only one that had some of the same, hobbies as me. And he would go to plays in Boston with his wife and get all dressed up. And he read good literature, and, we would talk, music. And he came up to see me one day in the control room, which is the bubble in the book. And he just kind of said, "What are you doing here? You should leave. You've been here 5 years, and now it's time to choose if you're going to do this for 20 or if you should leave." And he said, "You shouldn't do it for 20. He said, don't end up like me." And that was kind of like the, most honest conversation I had with anyone there. And he could only do it because we were alone in this sort of secluded control room. And I kind of said, he might be right. 26, and do I want to end up like these guys with 3 wives, and their whole paycheck is going to child support, and their pensions are going to be gone because they have to split it between 3 different women and 3 different families, and they're all really struggling. A guy I'd hear he's 44 years old, he looked like he was 55. It took everything out of you. And I kind of had that moment where I looked around. It would be like in the film where the character just kind of looks at everyone around him and gets up and is like, "Nope, I'm done." And I kind of had that moment. And I just gotten married. We just bought a house in November. We found out my wife was pregnant with our first kid, and I just got up and quit with no backup plan. So you can see how basically I was really done. And it was a risk, for my dad was a union worker with the post office 27 years. And when I got the job, he thought it was the best thing in the world because, "Oh, you're going to retire at 42? You kidding me?" And then when I told him I quit, he almost couldn't believe it. It was like, "Can you call and get your job back? Is it too late?" It was, he thought it was the stupidest thing I could have ever done. But I probably wouldn't have made it another 5 years working there.
Right. The personal cost wound up being too great for most of these guys.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, it's just about 5:45, so I think it's probably a good time to open this up to questions from the audience. David, do you want to share some with us?
I do. Thank you so much. And both of this has been so fascinating. There's a question in the chat from Scott. He says, "Dave, what's next for you? Are you working on something right now?"
Yeah, so I finished a collection of stories a few months ago that now I'm trying to place, but they all take place along the Merrimack River in some capacity. So again, I'm kind of using setting as the narrative throughway, but it's a bit it's not a novel. Every story is very different in a different place and time, and I'm just trying to give again a voice to this region. And now I'm working, hopefully finishing my second novel, which also takes place in Lowell, and it's about panhandlers and a Christmas tree farmer and a park ranger who keeps finding bodies. So it's very different than the jail. I really needed to just go outside and write a book that just takes place outside. There's only so many ways you can describe a concrete wall or a steel bed, and so I kind of wanted to let loose.
There's another question here from Carol. She says she's really enjoying how Dave is being interviewed by his former creative writing professor, and she loved hearing Dave's comment about how he learned from Ben how to lead a character to the door and end the story with the hand on the doorknob. Clearly a graceful and evocative way to end a work of fiction. Could either of you comment on other kinds of things that writers can learn about their craft from creative writing classes?
Well, I'll give one before Ben. I guess one of the things that I don't know, that I see a lot with my students is they kind of fake the writing. So it's sort of like they're mimicking what they think writing should be. And a lot of it, I think, is because they don't read as much as they should. And so a lot of it is them watching TV or video games and then writing like that. And so a lot of what I try to teach them in class is to write like a writer, to get sort of that TV drama, dialogue that sounds like it's a screenplay. I think they need to get back to what literature does. And so a lot of creative writing is just showing them, good literature to learn the craft of writing through. The best thing I ever was told about writing was you need to read more. And that was, the number one tip I ever needed was read more and read widely. And that helped me tremendously.
I agree that, especially with undergraduates, read more and stop writing like a TV show or a video game is very often the most important thing. When people are a little beyond that, when they're MFA students, the most common thing is learn a new practice of specificity. Sure, that you're supposed to be specific, but we need you to be specific in a way that you've never been specific before. You need to kind of trust that if you're really specific about how something looks, how it smells, its feel, its touch, that it'll show you where the story should go, that it will help you figure out which settings and characters are interesting and dynamic and scary and lovable and all that stuff. And if you don't delve into that level of really intense specificity, you'll never really figure out where the potential is. It's like how Dave knows that, in those Don and Ray dialogues, he won't just be like, hey, could you stop crinkling that bag of soup? I'm trying to sleep. He'll say, how hard is it to open a bag of soup? That level of specificity shows you what works and shows you what doesn't. You can't see what the potential is until you get that specific.
Thanks, that's great. Long question and comment here from Daniel Johnson. Says, so after hearing what you said regarding brotherhood mentality and not wanting to be an outsider, I saw in late September that there was a great profile of you in Barker House and the New Hampshire Union leader. And it made me wonder not only whether, but specifically when, you might have gotten feedback or messages from former colleagues at Valley Street who saw that you wrote the book. Did they feel like you betrayed the brotherhood, even though the book isn't in any way an expose? And would that have been the first they heard of it in the local Gazette 5 months after publication?
Well, they did know the book was coming because I had comments before it even came out that I was a traitor and I was, giving away the secrets before they had even read anything. They just got a hint that it was coming out, and that was probably Facebook and early reviews. And then when the article came out, one of the coworkers that I really got along with the most, we were carpool partners, and we'd gossip on the way in and get coffee and drive home together. And he reached out and said, I can't believe what you did. And why would you write a book like this? And when I asked him if he read it, he said, no, he's seen enough. Right. So still commenting on this sort of idea that I had betrayed them and they hadn't even taken the time to read it. Right. So if they did read it, they might see that I was trying, or hopefully did, shine a light on the difficulties of the job and maybe why they've had difficulties in their life. I feel like it might have been therapeutic for some of them to read it, but they did not.
Thank you. Question here from Sean. Dave, it's obvious you have a lot of empathy for your characters. How much did writing this book change the way you felt about the people you worked with, both the inmates and the COs?
I think it changed a lot for the people I worked with. I always had empathy for the inmates because I always felt like I was a red light away from being where they were. And I think that's how I approached the job. And that's why I was looked at as fair and consistent, because I knew um, I was towing a line at that point, and I knew mistakes happen. And so but when I did leave, I had a lot of anger for the people I worked with, for the positions they put me in, positions I didn't want to be in. But if I didn't act, again, I would have been looked at as an outsider. And so a lot of the things I did, I'm not excusing them, but I didn't anticipate them when I walked into work that day. I didn't go looking for it. I just happened there, and then I was put in a very bad position. And so I did have years of anger for, a lot of things we could have avoided. A lot of nightmares that I still have could have been avoided if someone just kept their cool for another 30 seconds. But in writing the book and reading a lot of sort of literature on the psychology of power, and I sort of realized that a lot of this is the system that does this to officers. And it's not, they didn't sign up to become sadists and to bully people and hurt them. They really just thought the pension was decent and they had a high school diploma and they really had nothing else going on. And so it seemed like a good job. And it was the power that was given to them, and no one telling them how to wield it, and no one telling them when to turn it off, or teach them how to use it. We weren't taught how to do that. It was, here's a badge, you run the unit, don't let anyone do anything you don't want them to do. And that was really it. So I did learn to empathize with the job and what they did. Now, if they're continuing to do it to this day and they've never learned, then that's on them. But a lot of people like me, they do leave. Everyone from my academy, there was 13 of us, no one works there anymore. They're all gone. And so at some point the light bulb turned on for all of us that was in that academy. But yeah, that's a good question.
Thank you. I just heard yesterday or the day before on VPR something about the correctional officers. There's like 200 people coming in and like 140 leave after a year. Thanks. Unless we have any other questions from the audience, we are just about out of time. I thought, Dave, Ben, maybe you could leave us with a few suggestions of books that you recommend or that are important to you.
Yeah, well, I just finished reading with my class Lot by Brian Washington. It's a collection of short stories, and his debut novel just came out, I think last week, Memorial, which is getting great reviews and which is next on my list. And there's a lot of heart in this book, and it's affected me more than any other book I've read this year. It's a fantastic book, and the voices are great, and that's sort of my recommendation right now. I'm telling everyone to read it. I'm kind of late to the game because I feel like everyone read it last year or the year before, but I'm pretending like it just came out and I'm just learning about it.
Dave recommended a very contemporary book, so I'll go in the other direction and say, if you like books that are basically linked stories about a particular community, like Dave's wonderful book, Barker House, you might go back to the original, which is Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio. It's a wonderful book. It holds up incredibly well. He literally mentored Faulkner. They would walk around New Orleans and get drunk together. And that's where Faulkner's Yoknebatafa County comes from, which is also in this tradition, a community with different stories and characters in it. So yeah, Winesburg, Ohio. Go back to the great granddaddy.
Dave, Ben, thank you so much. This has been a great event. I really appreciate it. I'm so glad that even if it's not in person, we got to do this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks so much. This is great.
Thank you all
so
for
much.
coming.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, Dave. Good job.
Thanks all. Have a great night.
Have a great night, guys.